This one is dedicated to the people of the ghettos, especially the people of Moss Side. It's time we live together.
When he first came, people would spit at black people. I remember one lady actually turned round. I'm sorry, I'm going back into the past again. One lady, she actually turned round and said she was actually at work. Whenever she went to the toilet, the white women would go
out of the toilet.
They go into the toilet because they wanted to see whether she had a tail.
Right, so this is our first podcast interviewing it. I hope there's more many, but we'd like to introduce Mr. Linford Sweeney, Moss Side historian. Should we call you a Moss Side historian or?
Not Moss Side, just
a
historian.
Historian,
I deal with everything.
You're living there, aren't you?
Could we say you specialise in Moss Side, maybe?
I wouldn't say I could be called special. I could specialise in Moss Side, maybe Manchester. Not strictly just Moss Side. It's because
you do a lot more. You know a lot more than that.
There's capacity in it. Okay.
But welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
What me and Neville are doing is we're trying to reach some young people, and we know how they can find history boring. So hopefully we can bring it to them and show them how important it is, and how history connects you to the present and the future, and it can help you put your life in a more positive direction by knowing the history of your people.
Okay.
So we would like to first, if you could give us a brief summary of say the 60s and 70s in Moss Side, what you remember, what it was like for the average Caribbean person, African person, working class
after
person.
the Windrush.
Well, as you probably know, there weren't a lot of people, Caribbean people living in Manchester until around after the war, the beginning of the First World War. And at one time, Oxford Road was the actual hub for Caribbean people.
Say you see not many people know.
That's exactly it. We had restaurants, we had houses, we had a bookshop on Oxford Road at that time, and also in 1945 we had the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester. So that a lot of those people who actually were part of what they call the Colonial Club, which existed in Manchester, many of those lived in Moss Side.
Could you just explain the Colonial Club?
It was basically a club where people from the Caribbean and Africa came together, and they met. And they talked, and it was a way of sort of, integrating with one another. And many of the intellectuals like C.L.R. James and people like Leary Constantine, the cricketer. C.L.R. James was the writer of Black Jacobins. People like T. Ras McConan, who owned most of these businesses and funded the 1945 Pan-African Congress. And a lot of other people like that actually came to Manchester. So Manchester was a hub at that time, and it became even more so after the war. With people like Sir Arthur Lewis, who was the first black professor in any university in the country, at the University of Manchester. So Manchester became quite important. However, in 1948, as you probably know, what we now call the Windrush generation came to Manchester, came to Britain, and by 1951 there were about 17,000 people living throughout the country, of which in Manchester there were a few, and many of those who settled in Manchester were also in the RAF during the war. Such as Mr. Houghton Christian, who was in the RAF, and then he came to Manchester to settle. Around that, later in the 50s, my father came here in 1959. And he came to work in the factories in Manchester, because Manchester was the first industrial city. I don't know whether you knew that.
No, I thought
It was the first industrial city.
I don't know, but Manchester.
Yep, because of cotton.
Right,
The cotton industry. So many of the women, particularly, worked in the cotton industry when they first came. My mother came. We came in 1964. I was a child then, and my mother worked in the cotton industry in Chadderton. My father then worked in a metal company. I can't remember the name of the company. And then he got a job in Kellogg's. So this is what it was like at that time.
Can I say it's strange because even though we were brought up in the 80s, the Kellogg's factory was still going, the sewing factories were still happening. My stepmother, she worked in a sewing factory herself with a lot of other mums. So to think that went back all the way then.
Well, the cotton industry was at its peak in Manchester around the early 1800s.
Right,
You know, so it's been happening for a long time.
So what about what else was it called? Dunlop as well. That you had.
Yeah, Dunlop. A lot of people from the of Caribbean descent also worked at Dunlop. They worked at various. There were various companies. I can't remember the names of all of them.
Can I ask you, so when would you say the initial Windrush generation was? Who can we say? Can we say it was the 60s, the 50s, the 40s?
Well, the Windrush generation, as we sort of identify it now, the people who came here between 1948 and the Empire Windrush was seen as like the beginning of the largest flow of Caribbean people into this country. They weren't the first, but there were two ships even before the Windrush. But the point is, they weren't the first, but the point is Windrush was the one that brought the majority, which was over 800 people to this country. And as a result, they then looked at anyone who came between 1948 and 1971, when they started stopping the flow.
Down. I think this is really important because a lot of people think there wasn't many black people in the country before World War II and so on. So it's good for people to understand we've been here a long time.
Well, put it this way, there were over 16,000 Caribbean people came here in the First World War to fight on the side of Britain. In the Second World War, much more than that came, of which are approximately, I think, around 500 or 600 of them were in the RAF, and some of them were flyers. They were actually flying the bombers and the planes. So many of them were sent back to the Caribbean after the war. They couldn't find work in the Caribbean for 2 years. They came back here, like Mr. Christian, and they came back and rejoined the RAF, and some joined the army, etc. And they then, once they left the RAF, they then settled in the various cities like Nottingham, in London, in Bristol, in Manchester, etc.
So, basically, how would you say it was growing up in Moss Side in the 60s and the 70s? We're trying to get beyond the Windrush and trying to talk about the first, the kids after the Windrush, the first British-born kids. So, how was it like in Moss Side in the 60s and the 70s?
Well, in 1961, there were approximately 170,000 Caribbean black people living in this country.
175.
This was around 1961. Remember, in 51 it was 17,000. It had grown to 174. By 71, it had grown to over 300,000.
And all of these are put into the same area around the country, into the same area.
Well, what happened is a lot of my family who came went to where the factories were. Some went to the Midlands, where lots of factories, car industries, etc. So if you look at where people are, they're mainly in places like Leicester, Nottingham, Bristol, various parts of London, Derby, Manchester, Preston, places where the industry happened. So growing up, I came here in 1964 with my mum, and it was a huge culture shock.
Right.
Because I was brought up in the country in
How old
Jamaica.
was you, sorry,
No,
when
I
you
was
came?
8.
8 when you
Yeah.
come over.
So now everybody knows my age. I was 8 when I came here with my mother. My father had already been here 5 years.
Okay.
And so when I came, it was just a strange place.
Yeah.
Because it was cold.
I'm a country boy.
It was, it was cold. People spoke literally differently,
Yeah.
a different language to me.
Were people a bit aggressive towards you because it's
Some were and some weren't.
Okay.
It really depended. It really depended. In school, there were some kids that were bullies.
Yeah.
They probably would have been bullies with anybody.
Yeah.
But quite a few were quite good. One particular lad who eventually became a boxer, he actually stuck up for me in primary school.
Okay.
And so people stopped bothering me after a while, because eventually he was a big guy, even then. And he went on to become a boxer.
Right, okay.
And his family were well known in the business industry in Manchester.
Right, okay.
So I remember him and what he did. And he helped. But I was chased many times from school. By kids, because this is the way it was at the time.
It was normal, I suppose. It became a normal thing.
It was normal because I had a different accent.
Yeah.
I was from another place.
Yeah.
When I spoke differently.
Yeah.
Did
you still carry a Jamaican accent at that age? Yeah?
I never used to look at the teachers in the face. Because Caribbean children, in the Caribbean, you were not allowed to look straight at the teacher when they're talking to you. You're supposed to hold your head down. In this country, the teachers say, look straight at me.
Yeah.
Straight away, that caused a culture clash.
So completely different cultures to clash straight away.
Exactly.
Isn't it? Yeah.
So what I enjoyed, though, were the summers. We had some great summers.
Right.
And when we had 6 weeks holiday, we just went everywhere. And we were allowed to play out until it was dark. And it was great times, Did you notice? Did you notice a difference to the people in your area and people who lived outside your area, class-wise, poverty-wise? Did you realise that you were? Did you realise that you were in a more
deprived area?
Not in the 60s.
Yeah.
Not in the 60s, because the good thing is you had people. I think the furthest I knew away from Mossad at that time was I heard about Wally Range.
Yeah. So.
And when I got to around the age of 13, 14, we used to go pick apples in Wally Range. I won't tell you too much about that. But anyway,
that was the nunnery.
Yeah, we used to pick apples and we used to go to Wally Range and we used to travel. But the point is, we never really left Mossad. We played in Mossad. We did everything in Mossad. And remember, this was the time when we had the old houses, the old back-to-backs, the old Victorian, before they knocked them down. And when they knocked them down, that created a major community problem. Because our community was fractured. It was literally destroyed because some people moved to Attersley, some moved to Partington.
And this is why they built the new estates.
Yes.
Yeah.
But remember, many went into Hume, into the bull rings. You remember those, all those Robert Adams, John Nash. So they weren't, and the housing was absolutely terrible. Because remember, they knocked them down. We moved into Hume, but luckily we moved into where the houses were as opposed to the masonettes.
So you didn't prefer the new houses to the old Victorian houses?
We did, because we lived in houses. We lived in a house, and it had underfloor heating. Now, for a kid, underfloor heating was great because you could just lie down on the floor and whatever. And it was a house like the house we were in, except it didn't have a attic and it didn't have a cellar. That was the only difference. But the house was really nice. We had a dining room, we had a kitchen, we had a sitting room, 2 toilet upstairs, 1 downstairs. It was for a child.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, to be honest with you. For then, that for something like that these days, you'd be gosh knows what you'd be paying for.
But also remember, when this happened, I was 16. at the time. So it's still a child,
You're still a child, of course.
But as a youth, it was really nice to be in that.
You're more a youth than a child, I suppose. You're a young man.
What was like obviously we all got a limited time on these things, so we've got to go through these questions, because we've got 45 minutes. Obviously, we would love to speak and have more. Obviously, we hope we can bring you back on the show.
Yeah.
But like, what about like the NHS and that health-wise? What was the health situation back then?
Oh gosh, it's you see. Remember, as a child, I didn't know anything about all of that.
Yeah.
I never. The only time I had a health issue was when I had a bit of epilepsy, because I suffered from it until the age of 10. So at 10 was the last time I had it, and I was taken to the hospital. And luckily they didn't keep me overnight, because I didn't really want to stay. I was 10 at the time. And that was my first experience of the NHS. But I didn't know it was called the NHS. It was just a hospital. So I didn't really know a lot about that. However, there were people who were sick and they'd go into hospital. So we just saw it as hospital.
And would you say back then, if you needed a doctor, you could get a doctor?
Oh yes, doctors. Our doctor, Dr. Wilson, was actually on Alexandra Road, the old Alexandra Road, and he was on the corner of Great Western Street and Alexandra Road, and that's where we used to go when we had the flu or whatever. And he was a great doctor. He looked after us. He spent time with us, not like today, where doctors just don't have the time. But in those days, he was a really good doctor. So
because a lot of people think back then it must have been hard. People would get sick and really it seemed to be better back then than it is now.
No, we had good doctors. Nowadays, you want a doctor, it's very difficult sometimes. They normally send for you rather than you actually go to them.
Well, so when things should be progressing, and we're all taught to look and think, oh, things are progressing, science is progressing, everything. But really, 30, 40, 50 years ago, you were looked after better than we are now?
I wouldn't say better. I would say we had more time with the doctors. However, because we were people of colour, many of the doctors then didn't fully understand us. They didn't understand what was going on with us. Take, for instance, high blood pressure, diabetes, all those things, even cancer. My cousin passed away of cancer. She went to the doctors, they just gave her tablets.
So they didn't understand.
It was tablets for everything, or an injection. And so by the time they caught the cancer, it was too late.
Well, why would you think? I don't understand that. Why would they? I can understand we say something like sickle cell, something they might not have been used to, but something like cancer, how can they think you are different to treat than a normal Europeanity all the time?
I think when black people, when our Caribbean people first came here, they were seen as different. And my father tells me the story of when he cut himself. And the white guys all gathered around. And they say, your blood's red.
Oh, you're kidding me.
They could not believe that his blood was red.
Crazy.
That is the situation. Even when they had were washing, because people worked at Dunlop's, got very dirty, so they had places to wash before they came home. I worked in a rubber factory also in Salford, so I know what they used to get up to in terms of the soot and everything that was used to make the rubber. So they had to wash, and whenever he went in to wash, it was a question, not him, not my father, but my father's friend. They wondered why all the blackness wasn't coming off, because it came off them, but it was. They say, "Oh, can't you get it all off?" These are the sort of things that were going on. So in reality, you can see.
To you just brush it off your shoulder.
That's exactly it. And the people who came here for 5 years to work, and then to go back, but then found out things were too hard. So they had to then send for their families to join them and to give their children a better opportunity.
Which is only the right human thing to do. But there's just so much animosity towards that. It's But you know, which human doesn't want a better life and make things better for
exactly.
the family?
And it's still happening today. Even
It's still
people are
happening
travelling
today.
for economic reasons.
Of course, yeah.
How would you tell? Could you tell us a bit about the sus law and how it affected people in Moss Side?
Ooh, sus law. That's an interesting one. For those who are not aware as to what sus means, it means suspect.
Okay,
Yeah?
right, yeah.
But funnily enough, the sus laws came out of the Vagrancy Act
And what would be
in the 1820s.
Okay.
I think it was 1823. And basically people who were walking about on the streets didn't have a home. They could be arrested.
Okay.
And they were seen as criminals in some cases because they were walking around on the street. They're thinking, well, they will steal because they've got, because they have nothing to eat. So as a result, that law was never repealed.
Right.
So when it came to the 1970s, particularly, a lot of the young people, many of whom came here like me, and they were now in their teens, and many who were born here, who are now getting into their teens, started having identity issues. They started looking around to see, it was all about Young, Gifted and Black and the Black Panthers and all of this. It was about trying to find themselves because there was this racism going on. And they were trying to find themselves. So many of them went down the route of sound systems. Many went down the route, a lot of young people, particularly within the Caribbean community, we all used to gather together on the street corners. Part of that had to do with when the Caribbean men first came to this country.
So that was nothing to do with back in Jamaica. That was just
no, it does have something to do with back in Jamaica, but it mainly had to do with when they first came, and there were gangs of teddy boys who used to chase them. So they started going around together in groups. So it became something that even the younger people started doing to keep themselves safe. But the simple point is the sus law came out and it became part of that racial discrimination element where the majority of those who were stopped were young black youths.
It seems to me like that is the new stop and search laws are just a continuation of that with a different name.
I've been stopped several times.
Young people of colour, black
That's
people.
Correct.
It's and there's an argument for people.
You say this though, but then obviously, how did it affect Irish people? Because obviously we know Irish people went through a lot of problems as well, didn't it?
Yes, Irish people went through a lot of problems. When I first came here, the Irish were, they used to have a sign in the windows. No Irish, no blacks, no dogs.
How were the police towards the Irish?
I personally I can't speak for the Irish as such. But I knew the gypsies had problems, even though some people used to say the gypsies were Irish. It wasn't always the case. But there were issues with the gypsies. But the point is with us, I know about us. I've been stopped many times, and the police stopped me and basically searched my bag and wanted to know where I was coming from, where I was going, what did I have in my bag.
Resentment, a little bit of resentment.
A lot of resentment as a result, and on top of that, the other issue was that by the 1970s, many of the industries that were in Manchester started going to London. Many were falling apart, like, for instance, the cotton industry and others. So as a result, many people started. Luckily, I was one that I could get jobs. But many of those who wanted to work in factories were having problems. So a lot of the young youth were unemployed. So youth unemployment in Moss Side at one point went up to 70%.
What was that? You said that was the 70s, 80s?
Around the 70s. It was just before, put it this way, when Thatcher, in 1981, when the uprisings happened, what we call the Moss Side Riots, which happened all over the country, by the way, and not just in black areas, it happened in the northeast as well, it happened in various places which had no black populations. The riots, as we know it, when it happened in 1981, there were 2 million people unemployed. That's a lot of people. 2 million people unemployed, so that didn't help. The sus laws didn't help. the resentment and all the issues relating to that didn't help.
Bubbling pot.
Community activists like Gus John and others tried to get things,
maybe we should
help
put some
things.
of these names in there, and, so people can look into these names.
Yes,
Yeah.
but people like that, Mrs. Dakokodia, Mrs. Edwards, Cass Locke, those people were like our activists. Berry Edwards, they always were our activists. They tried.
People had no voice. No one gets to hear.
That's exactly. They tried to be the voice for the community, but nobody was listening.
No one was listening at the time.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
The only time people listened was after the riots, and then other things that came into place.
What was the community's reaction to this, to the way the sus laws and the way things were in the community, and the lack of work and things like that?
Well, this is what I was saying. There was a lot of
police.
resentment about it, and people were saying, "Is it because we're black? Why?" I remember going for a job once, and I went into the room, and the three people who were white just looked at one another. Because my name sounded English. They just looked at one another, and would you believe, for the next 30 minutes, the interview was not about the job I'd applied for. It was another job, and I have no idea what that job was about. That's the sort of issues that were happening with a lot of black kids who wanted to get jobs.
I find it so sad that it's just like a continuous circle, because the same things are happening now in different ways.
Yes.
Like we said, the SUS law is now the stop and search law.
Yeah.
When you go in and into a room with white people and they all look at you and you get that certain feeling.
Yep.
You can go into an area today.
Yeah.
Which predominantly white, hardly any people of colour there. You can walk into a pub or a cafe or a restaurant and all eyes are on you and you still get them same feelings. So how nothing has changed in all these years?
Some people would say some things have changed,
Some things have changed.
Other things may not have changed. The question is, what weight do you put on the things that changed and the things that didn't change?
And we need to educate our
going back
sorry.
to what you were asking about the community reaction. As I said, there were people like those people I've mentioned who tried to get their voices heard, and their voices weren't being heard in some cases. In many cases they weren't being heard. Even back in the 70s, there were issues with ESN schools, which were educationally subnormal. And
Special schools, what they call
special schools they call them now, but in those days they called them educational, special needs.
SEND schools, sorry, it's like a SEND school.
But in those days, it was mainly black kids that were being sent to them.
I was used to say, I had to go to a special school, and man said, nah, you're not doing it.
This is exactly it.
And what would the reasoning be, to saying you're a bit slower than white folks?
I was taken to a psychologist. By my father, and they gave me a lot of tests and a lot of things to do. Luckily, I was one of those who passed it because I enjoyed the test. But not all kids would have enjoyed those.
And then they would have been sent to one of these schools.
And many of them were sent. Many of them were sent. And here's the worst thing: they came out not being able to read and write.
Of course, because they're being sent to a school what's treating them like they're slower, so they're not going to give them the right education, are they?
So a lot of people like Gus John and others actually went out on marches in Manchester to actually try and get people to listen to the fact that these kids shouldn't be in those schools.
I'd just like to say, also, kids, these have been going on for a long time. These marches, this activism, this fight against racism, and this class injustice and inequality. It's been going on for many years. It's not a new thing, but it needs to start being addressed.
And can also say, even in school, there was a thing called teacher expectation. There were I had two teachers that expected more of me. The rest didn't. Because that's the way they were taught. You know, and so I remember a teacher, I said I wanted to do O-level English. Now, I was already, O-level is what they call GCSEs now. I was actually I was going to evening classes with all the other kids who were doing O-level English, and yet I was told, sorry, you're not capable of it. And also a careers officer turned around to me at the age of 13 or 14, I think I was 13 or 14, and I said I wanted to be an industrial designer.
Okay.
And he literally almost laughed at me. And he said, you'd be better off sweeping up in an engineering factory.
Yes.
Guess what my first job was? Sweeping up in an engineering factory.
But look how you
Teacher expectations.
That's such a big thing. That's something, again, where not many people... because if you're working with a bunch of teachers who don't expect much from you, they're never going to get the best out of you.
Yep.
If you're working with a teacher who wants to see you do good and believes in you,
That's it.
then how
And
much
this
more
is again
productive will you be?
another response from the community trying to deal with that.
Yeah.
And they also were using books like by Bernard Code, how the British system under I can't remember the exact title.
Okay.
We'll
put some of this in the bio.
But Bernard Code wrote a book about ESN schools, and that was one of the launching pads for actually dealing with those things.
Right, good, yeah.
All over the country, but in Manchester in particular.
Okay.
Just that's because we're wrapping up. But how did the law and the sus law and the community, the perception with the police, how did it affect things like that, mistrust of the police and things like that?
Well, as I said, there was a lot of mistrust of the police by young people. They didn't want to deal with the police. They hated the police. They hated the government and any officials, like the local authorities, etc.
Anarchy, not anarchy.
So,
Anarchy,
because obviously of the way they were treated. I'm not saying that every single young black person was treated this way. Some managed to get through. But a lot of those who didn't, particularly those who actually felt that they were British and they should be treated the same way as everybody else, a lot of them decided to kick off.
Again, it's only
melting pot.
Melting pot. It's only human nature. You're gonna have the odd person who can seem to get through it. When we were growing up, when we grew up in gangs, and say on our estate, everyone was in a gang, but you might have one kid who stuck it out, went to school, went to college, and he was the exception. The majority of the kids stuck together and just followed each other.
Well, I did both.
Did you do both?
I was in a gang. When I was around 14,
Well, when
15.
you say gang, you mean a gang is more like protection to protect yourself.
Yeah, it was a gang of kids. I was the only black kid in that gang. They were all Irish and white. And
I'm surprised you weren't secure.
But funnily enough, I was the tallest and I was the fastest runner and everything. So they got me to do almost everything. The only thing I wasn't allowed to do is touch the white girls. I'm being serious. It was like that. It was like that at that time.
You did have it a lot worse, though. It was so blatant.
It was very blatant.
So like, if you did try and date a white girl, then what would be the consequence?
No, I'm talking about kissing. You know, they had.
But even
the gangs. Though the gangs had this thing with they had girls. There was a thing called catch a girl, kiss a girl type of thing. I know. These kids did the kids do all sorts of things. And so they were the ones who always caught the girls, you see, because there were no black girls. It was all white girls and the gang was white.
Chasing these white girls around, didn't it?
But funnily enough, at the time it didn't seem like a lot to me. But now looking back, I'm thinking, you know, that's what used to happen. They had me in the gang because I was good at certain things. Yeah.
So you had to use if you know use, then you know use, innit?
You guys paved the way for us people of colour today because you took the brunt of it. You took people before yourself, your parents took the brunt of it.
My father, when he first came, people would spit at black people. I remember one lady actually turned round. I'm sorry, I'm going back into the past again. One lady, she actually turned round and said she was actually at work. Whenever she went to the toilet, the white women would go
out on the toilet.
They go into the toilet because they wanted to see whether she had a tail. I'm being serious. It was as bad, blatant as that.
It is. It's just disgusting.
And even on one occasion, let's just say, I don't know whether I can say this on the podcast, but one of the things she did on one occasion, she basically just showed them that she had no tail. And obviously, this was in the ladies. But as I said, this is the situation that many people found themselves in.
What like, because we've got to wrap up things. What was like the effect and like what was the effect of like the riots and like the trauma and the emotional?
Right.
What was after the riots? What was left afterwards?
Well, I can tell you, I was lucky enough or unlucky enough, depending on how you want to look at it, to see what happened on the night when the police charged everybody, where the vehicles were driving around with police in the back, chasing after people, when they had the baton charges and the riot shields and the helmets. Do you know that Manchester, the great Manchester police, were the first to have riot equipment in this country? That was James Anderton who brought it.
Was that for the riot?
No.
Was that the one that had a big stick in it? Was that
They had sticks and they had shields before.
No, but Anderton was either.
Anderton with a beard, and a
he used to
moustache.
rock with a stick. He used to have a stick. He was scary.
Yeah.
Don't you remember him?
Yeah, James Anderton, look him up.
I'm sure he came to my house one time saying he'd get me locked up, man. Give me trouble now.
But he was the chief constable at the time.
He was scary, man.
So this guy was a bully at his time and then he went on to be chief police.
You used to see him he'd have a big stick when he's walking around. You remember him from back in the days, bro.
I didn't pay much attention.
He wore the uniform, but he stood up. He just stood up.
Really tall. I think I've seen pictures.
You've seen it, bro.
But all I'm saying is that in terms of that, the issues, I'd say I actually hid. I actually had to run into a friend's house when it started, because I saw people going down Princess Road, smashing all the shops, not all, but some shops, including Barry's, where my best friend actually had a suit. In those days, Barry's was a clothes shop. Right. And in those days, you could go in and you'd put a certain amount of money down. And when you finished paying, you took your suit out. My friend had one payment left and the shop went up in flames. Yes? So what I'm saying, I saw all of that. And then I saw all the baton charges. I saw all the things. But I stood at the window and watched all of that.
And do you think the police were way overzealous, heavy-handed? Do you think they
wanted to get their own back in it after what happened, innit?
And also, can I mention something to you? Because a lot of people think it was just black people. They were just about, I'd say, a third of the people, if not a half of the people who were in that were actually white people.
Some people might not agree with this, but I've always thought the only way we're going to get through racism is to have white allies. You need white allies and good white people. That's the only way you can get through it. I'd like to ask you though, did you think that after the riots it brought the community closer together?
I'd say for a time it was a little bit fractured. It was, because nobody knew what to do and what was happening, because businesses had lost their livelihood. Those businesses had been there since I was 8 years old.
Did they never come back?
Did you say there was something about the one shop that did not get burnt down?
Yes, it was Mr. Phillips's shop. He stood outside and he basically, I knew the Phillips because I went to school with his children. They were in my year at school, his twins. But as I say, I remember when I was doing a talk on the riots, he stood outside his shop, and when people recognized him, they just ran by. And he just stood outside his shop and to stop people from actually...
And was this a black man?
He was a black man, a Jamaican man. So that's one thing that we remember. But a lot of the other shops all got destroyed. And the other thing about it wasn't just Manchester people that were there. There were lots of people from outside of Manchester who also came in.
I wanted to ask you this because obviously we've got to close up on this thing, but When the riots went off and it was going on in different places, like, we didn't have phones back in the days, mobile phones or internet, like, yeah, we're going to start rioting, let you do it, and then, would you think it was orchestrated between the different places, the different areas, like the different cities, or do you think it was just...
I couldn't tell you, I don't know how they did it.
Organised,
but obviously...
Do you think there was a level of orchestration?
I would have said there would have been, because remember, it started off in London. You see, and then it went to Toxteth and Bristol and Handsworth and it went to over into Liverpool, but not just Toxteth. Even in Merseyside in general, it actually happened. It happened in the northeast. It happened in a lot of places, but some were following others. Yeah. So those who had all probably rioted, this is just my estimation, probably actually came and talked to others and say, listen, if we're going to have any change at all, this is what you've got to do. Whether they were right or wrong, that's another story. But the point is, what happened after the riots was interesting because £10 million was put into Mossad. And as a result, they set up a whole range of different organisations, business organisations, all sorts. I was involved in some of that. And other people like Mrs. Dakakodia was involved with the Heitner committee to look into the riots in Mossad. So it was a good thing for a few years, up to probably the late 80s. And then things just, in the 90s, things started going back then.
Around the 80s.
It could be.
She came in 79, and she was in for 3 terms, I think it was. So 79, 84, 88, 92, I think.
She was until 92.
She was remember, she was eventually pushed out in the 90s, and John Major took over.
So just got Margaret Thatcher and all that period is a whole new story, a whole different episode. But would you say that the activism kind of worked in that case then for a little bit because it got money brought into the area?
Yes, it did work for that period. But as you know, throwing money into an area without looking at the long-term benefits may not necessarily work. The same thing happened. We had a guy called Ted Watkins came from the United States, and he came to talk about the Watts riots in 1965 over in Los Angeles. And he said the same thing. Lots of money was put into the area, but then literally there was no long-term strategy.
Some kind of structure for the youths to follow.
But it was good while it lasted because we had lots of projects for young people, lots of things going on.
So it was, and it's sad it just fell back into the same thing again because there was no base, there was no structure and base there, no one built a proper base. Well, can I ask you one last thing? What advice would you give? What advice, if any, and you don't have to if you need time to think of it. What advice would you give to a young people growing up in this world in Manchester today, who's struggling with identity or just somewhat positive?
Well, I ran a course some years back for via the University of Manchester, 2015, 16, I think, 2015, and it was called Know Your History, Know Yourself. And that to me is what it's about. It's not just about knowing your history. You've got to analyse history, you've got to look at history, you've got to learn from history. There's no point knowing the history and not learning from it. And then you've got to apply that to yourself today. And then you've got to see what you can do that's gonna make changes for the future, for yourself, for your community, your family, for your community, for the country.
Think outside that box. Think outside just this bunch of mates, this little
because
area.
It's not just about us, is it?
No.
It's not just about us. It's about our families. It's about our friends. It's about our community. It's about the whole country. Because whatever happens in the country affects us, and whatever we do can affect the country.
All right. But yeah, on that note, Mr. Sweeney, it's been good to interview you.
Yeah, good. And if you
But I'm
could,
sure we'll bring you back on the show again.
we could have you back sometime.
Yeah, definitely. Where we can do it, but obviously we're limited at this time. But yeah, it's been good to have you on, and I look forward to having more interviews with you and more discussions with you. But what are you doing with yourself?
I'm basic at the moment. I'm running various programs. I'm running courses with in collaboration with the university. I've just run a genealogy project, looking at DNA and everything of the Caribbean people with the university. They're very supportive. The history department of the university, absolutely amazing people. And I'm currently in the process of running a program about teaching black history to young people. So the idea is to find people who are interested in teaching black history to young people.
Find you with that?
They can get in touch with me on my website, inspiredhistories.com. Or they can email me at inspiredhistories@gmail.com. And do you run? You told me you run. You do shows every night on Instagram. Yes, myself and my daughter, we run an Instagram live. Normally on a Monday, unless it's a bank holiday or we're away, on a Monday evening, 8 until 9, and it's on Speak Your Truth Youth, which is Speak SPK, Your Truth Youth _MCR for Manchester. And we're on at 8 o'clock normally on a Monday, and we talk about everything. We've done over 120 lives so far. And you can go on to Instagram and actually see all the lives we've done at that at Speak Your Truth Youth Manchester.
Sounds good, positive, and thank you for everything you do.
And it's mainly for young people, by the way. Thank you.
Especially the people of most side. Sky we live.